We're just looking back at chapter 10. Last time we sort of read through it and mined it for some data. And I was just mentioning to Lois that when we did that, it's sort of interesting how this was presented. It's presented in a way where it starts off with kind of general information in the command. And then as it goes on, it sort of expands it and then fills in some of the details. We still are not left with an absolute a picture. We have like a jigsaw puzzle, and certain of the pieces have been put in, and we have a sort of general image, but there's still data that's left undone. But imagine you have this puzzle and you're told to assemble pieces, or maybe it's even like a recipe, a different metaphor, like a recipe. And so you're given certain instructions and you're looking at those instructions and you realize there's still some stuff that's not clear. And then as the verses go on, they fill in more of the details, answering some of those questions about wasn't clear, but maybe introducing new details that bring up questions, and it sort of unfolds that way. So like in chapter 10 of Bamidbar, chapter 10, verse 2, it starts by saying, make for you. Now he's talking to Moshe. It said, God is speaking to Moshe in verse 1. And he says to Moshe, make for you, singular, aseh lecha, make for you, singular, 2 chatzotzros. Make them out of one piece of silver, and you'll use it to call the Ada. Ada is one of the words that we use for community or group of people, in order lemasa tamachanot, and also for when the camps travel. So it sounds like these are for Moshe, but if these are for Moshe, why does he need two? What does he need two for? If this is for him to actually use in order to call what they're calling the Ada, that community, and for the group to travel. And then in verse 3, v'tak'u bahen, and they, plural, will blow at them. So we were wondering why, if this was for Moshe to blow, then why he would need two. And now suddenly other people are blowing them. Other people are blowing them. V'tak'u bahen, and they will blow them. V'no adu elecha kol ha'eda el pesach or moed. And the community, again, the verb is related to the noun. The noun is Ada, and no adu is like the verb connected to, so they will so it's usually translated as they will gather, or they will form Ada, this community or congregation. And they're going to be, the Ada is going to be called to the opening of the Ohel Moed. So last time we talked about Ohel Moed. In almost all of the circumstances, when it uses the term Ohel Moed, tent of meeting, again with that word Moed, gathering, same root as the verb before and the noun before, the Ada. There it sounds like a gathering place, but almost all the times when it's used to mean the Mishkan. It's another word for the Mishkan, the tabernacle. But there are a couple places where that does not seem to be the case, where there seems to be a separate tent, where Moshe would be, and then others would gather to Moshe at that separate tent. So that's not exactly clear. What is Ohel Moed at this point? And then ve'im ba'achat yitka'u, if they blow it once, that's how you read it, even though it could be read if they blow with one of them, if with one of them. But usually it's translated as if you signal one blast, V'noa du elecha hanesiim Roshei Alfei Yisrael. New information. The Nisi'im, the heads of the tribes, and this sound, it's first it just sounds like the heads of the tribes, but then it seems to further modify it to say the heads of the thousands of Israel. So you see how it's like information's given, and then there seems to be a further unfolding. Are we given to believe that the Ada that they've been talking about, the community, is not the entire congregation of Israel, but rather these people, these elders, that these princes or the heads of the thousands of Israel,
The heads of families?
but it says Roshei Alfei Yisrael, like it sounds like these are people, they seem to have had a kind of military hierarchy where you had people in charge of this many people, the people in charge of that many people, people in charge of that many people. So these would be it sounds like at the highest part of the hierarchy of the leadership. But if we're just, trying to fill in the puzzle or fill in the recipe, if we're trying to get a more specific sense of what's being taught, if this is an unfolding, so this is now more definition to who this Ada is, that the Ada are select leaders. They're not just the broader community. And then we had, so up until now, when it talked about sounding, it used the word tekiah. And then in Hey, it says utakatem trua. So here, it sounds like tekiah is a kind of verb, but trua is the noun. In other words, the actual character of the sound. What does it sound like?
Yeah.
It would be a trua. Now, if this is the same as what we do on Rosh Hashanah, trua is more than one sound. It's several sounds. It's either 3 sounds or it's 9 sounds, a group of sounds. But the kia, again, if we're using information we have from other sources, which is not always the case, that it applies to what the Torah is talking about. But let's assume for right now, because we don't have other things to draw on. So there's a different sounding from these trumpets. And that different sounding indicates that the camps are going to move. And so then, how are they going to move? So that also is part of this unfolding of information. Utekatem trua shenit. So you're going to blow this a second time. V'nasu hamachanot hachonim teimana, and those that are camped Teiman. Oh, I'm sorry. 5 said Kedma. Kedma is the biblical word for east. Kedma is the biblical word for east. So the eastern camps would start to move. And then it doesn't say in which general direction they're moving, but those camps are the first to move. And then utekatem trua shenit, and then you're going to blast another trua, v'nasu hamachanot hachonim teimana, trua yitku l'masehem. So now the ones that are in the direction which is called Teimana. So Teimana is to the south, and this could be, etymologically, this could be the reason it's called Teimana.
It's Sparty.
Right? No, it's not Yemenites, but rather it could be that it comes from Yamin. It's related to the word to the right. So if you're facing east, then your right would be to the south. So even though there is a nation which even is identified in Tanakh as Teman, but here most likely because we're talking about directions, it derives of the word yamin, which is to the right. So then they are. So it only talks about the east and the western groups. Then it says in 7, Ubahakil et kahal titku velo tariu. When you're gathering the community, you blow tekiah, you don't blow trua. Now, is this the same community that they were talking about before? Because they used a different word. They used Ada before. And here they're using the word kahal. Kahal is also a word for community or gathered people. And then sort of now we're wondering, who were these people blowing? Ubnei Aaron HaKohanim yitku b'chatzotrot, v'yolachem lechukat olam ladorotechem. And the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, they're going to blow these chatzotrot, and it will be for them an everlasting statute.
So they took the second one and gave it to them.
Or both of them.
Yeah.
In other words, for some reason, Moshe is supposed to make them, but they're the ones who are going to blow them for some reason. Again, what's left out here and what's sort of confusing is the change in the term here. Right. And also, how do you read this Ubnei Aaron HaKohanim? Is it in fact clarification going all the way back to the beginning and telling us they're always the ones who blow the
right?
Or is this going forward? So let's read going forward, where it says, "V'chitavo milchama ba'artzachem," when war comes to your land, al hatzar hatzorer etchem, an enemy which is encircling you, v'harei otem b'chatzotzrot, you will. Now here it sounds like trua, because it's using the verb that's connected to trua, not takatem, but v'harei otem. You'll make the trua sound to indicate war. V'nizkartem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem, and you will be remembered for the Lord, before the Lord your God. V'noshatem me'oivechem, and you will be saved from your enemies, or you will have salvation from your enemies. So here it sounds like a different purpose. Before, it was pragmatic. How do people know to come for a gathering? How do people know when they're supposed to travel? Here, this seems to be different. So that's why that verse in Ches could pivot. In other words, is it referencing back that they're always the one to blow it, even for gathering of the elders and telling the camps to move? Or is it introducing this next section that in the future, when you're in the land, the Kohanim are going to be the ones to blow it?
That's what it looks like.
Right. So it could go, because we saw that it went plural, and then suddenly other people are blowing it while they're in the desert. Who are these other people? So we're tempted to draw from verse 8 and say these other people are the Kohanim. But it's also possible to read this. No, this is introducing step 2 or part 2. There was what happened in the desert, and then there's what's going to happen when you're in the land of Israel, because it ended with, this will be an everlasting statute for all generations. So what is it referring to? It might just be referring to the future. When you get into the land, this is going to be the job of Kohanim, and they're going to blow it under these circumstances.
Well, because when we get into the land, Moshe's not there.
Right. So it could be that Moshe was a part of the blowing. It could be Aaron is a part of the blowing. It could be Leviim are part of the blowing. It doesn't clarify who's blowing it. So we have some data in verse 8, but you don't know if you're supposed to apply it before or after. Also, this is a shift because now you're not blowing it for pragmatic reasons to call the people, even to call the people to battle. You're now blowing these trumpets, and again, these are trumpets, not the shofar. You're now blowing these trumpets to call God's attention, as it were. Uviyom simchaschem, and on your days of happiness, ubamoadechem, there's your moed again, your gathering days. Ubaroshe chodshechem, at your Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month. Utekatem b'chatzotzros, al olosechem. So it sounds like you are meant to blow these. Now, again, the way it unfolds, is it saying that you blow them sort of liberally on these days, but you also blow it al olotechem, val zivchei shalmechem, on your elevation offerings or on your peace offerings? Is that what it's saying? Or is it saying, it's sort of qualifying it? You blow it on your days of joy and your gathering days and your heads of the month. And when do you blow it? You blow it at the time of the offerings. So the trumpets would be sounded at the times of the offerings. And again, va'yulachem lezikaron lifnei Elokeichem. And again, what's the purpose of this? To be remembered before God. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I'm the Lord your God. Now, this thing of being remembered before God, this is a usage of the word to be remembered, to be remembered in reference to God. So if we take for granted, which we do, that God is always paying attention, so why do you need to blow these to call God to attention? Okay, and also just question from what we had learned before in the previous section that we studied, which was about the clouds of glory. This is a question from Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar, the Or HaChaim's commentary on the Torah. He just asks, weren't the clouds supposed to be the indication that we're moving? Let's go back to the pragmatic section of this. In the pragmatic section, there were two purposes. One was to gather people. The other one was to signal that the camps are moving in the desert. And it was very specific about the east and the south. It does not talk about the west and the north. Only the east and the south. But it's very specific that when they hear the signal, it's going to be a trua sound from the trumpets, they're going to start moving. So weren't they all looking at the cloud, and weren't they traveling based on the cloud that was going? So that's his question. He has a couple answers. One of them could be that by the time the cloud's going to indicate direction, right? But it's not necessary. In other words, you're going to sort of follow the cloud to see where to go. But before you actually move, you have to get ready to move. Yeah, you have to get ready to move. So it could be, it's like a combination that the call is to the camps to get ready to move, which anybody who has had to be a group leader, especially for Jews, if you have to be a group leader for Jews, you know that the part where you're getting ready to go takes a lot longer than group leaders have the patience for. So you could imagine when you're dealing with such large groups that you'd need
And
a
if they're
warning.
Israelis.
Right. They're not, yeah,
Either.
because they're about to be. They're about to be. They're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But so you'd so he's suggesting that you'd still need a signal to get ready. Now, then the question is, why does it only identify the east and the southern groups? So it's possible that once they're all getting ready, everybody else figures it out. You have the west and the north can see that the east and the south are getting ready to move, and that's enough of an indication.
Yeah, because you figure east will be moving towards west and south will be moving towards north. So they'll kind of meet in the middle.
Everybody else would sort of hear about it. That could be why there needs to be such an economy of these blasts. Maybe it starts to become confusing if there's a lot of blasts. It sounds, we're not used to things being so pragmatic.
No, because we have cell phones now. So.
Right. Right. So, so that's the stuff that we saw, and then it ends, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm the Lord your God. So this seems to be self-contained. It starts with an introduction, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, and God spoke to Moshe saying, and it ends with a summation, I am the Lord your God. So it seems to be marked off as a self-contained section here in this whole thing. This is not something that we're used to as part of our religious experience, the sounding of trumpets. We're very used to the shofar blowing. We're not used to the sounding of trumpets, even though it says here it will be an everlasting statute for your generations.
Replaced with sirens?
That would be interesting as to...
No indication. But...
Right. The Temple Institute, when they're reenacting let's say the Pesach offering, when they're reenacting it, because they're practicing it, so that when the Beit HaMikdash is built, people will be able to do it immediately. So they have, groups of Kohanim that have been practicing the Pesach offering, how to bring the Pesach offering. I don't know if you noticed this, but there was at least one person arrested during Sukkot for trying to bring in a lamb again. This time it would be a Sukkot offering, one of the Sukkot offerings. There's many Sukkot offerings. I don't know. It was either a lamb or a goat. He would need to have a lot more if he was going to do a full Sukkot thing. The Pesach one is easier because there is a separate command just to bring the Pesach offering, which is just one animal, for the groups. Anyways, when you see them practicing, they do have these trumpets. They have two trumpets, two silver trumpets, which they've made to measure. And so you see them blowing those trumpets as part of the Pesach offering practice. So they certainly expect that when the Kohanim, when let's say the Pesach offering comes back, that they will use these trumpets. The question is, so when we were reading verse 10, in verse 10, we wondered, I was wondering out loud, was it just saying, because it starts off by saying, on your days of Simcha, like for instance, Sukkot is called, it says in Sukkot, the commandment is V'hayita achsam, that you will be happy, that it's a day of joy. One of the mitzvahs on Sukkot is joy, and it's considered a day of joy. There are times when the three pilgrimage festivals are compared to each other, and so we transfer this commandment to be joyous, to Pesach and Shavuos as well. That these are called days of joy. So that would be interesting as to, perhaps those days of joy are the pilgrimage festivals. Moadechem would be other holidays, and in this case, in the Torah, there's just Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, besides the 3 pilgrimage festivals there. But there is Rosh Chodesh, but Rosh Chodesh is identified separately here. So it's interesting to think about what Moadechem is. But again, was it saying that there is a commandment just to blow the trumpets on those days, or is it limited to the offerings that are brought on those days, the elevation offering and the peace offerings? So if you say it's limited to the elevation and the peace offerings, that would be why we don't blast trumpets on our holidays, because we don't have these now. But when we have these, then we would blow them, but we don't have these offerings now. So so that's what we sort of gather from a read through here. So as far as that question about the word kahal in verse 7, which is a different verb and a different noun, a synonym to Ada, Rashi in his commentary suggests that this is the same thing. This is 2 ways of saying the same thing. This is not a different gathering. There is something called Hakel, for instance. Hakel is a once in 7 year event that happened last year. In the Shemitah cycle, it would be last year, because it would be the gathering at the end of the Shemitah cycle. And there they call it Hakel, which is a term for gathering. But there, the understanding is you're gathering everybody. You're not just gathering leaders.
Could it be from the word Kehillah?
Yeah, that word Kehillah is related to it. But that word hakahal, the word kahal, is a version of that word Kehillah. But Rashi's understanding it as just another way of saying what they said earlier, which was Ada. Ada. Again, Ada means community, but it's being qualified very, soon after to mean the leadership. So you might wonder, maybe there's when you gather the leadership, and then there's whether you gather the leaders. Maybe there's 2 different types of gathering.
One of the explanations that's here.
Yeah, so could you read your explanation?
Let me see where that part starts. Okay, when they sound a long blast, the tekiah and the teruah of this passage were the same as the blasts of those names that are sounded on Rosh Hashanah. Tekiah was a long, clear blast of the trumpet, and teruah was a series of short staccato blasts. When both trumpets sounded at tekiah, it signaled the entire nation to assemble at the tabernacle. Such a blast from a single trumpet summoned the leaders.
Okay, now go on.
Teruah blast would signal the 3 tribe formations that they were to begin the journey. The sages derived exegetically that as on Rosh Hashanah, each teruah was preceded and followed by a tekiah. The first camp to embark was the one to the east, that of Judah. Next was the tribal group to the south, that of Reuben. Although the passage does not mention the formations of Ephraim and Dan, The sages derived that the same procedure was followed for them. Verse 7 makes clear that a teruah was sounded only for the journeys, but not as a summons.
Okay, and do you have anything else about these soundings going forward?
The eternal decree, though the trumpets made in the wilderness were used solely during the tenure of Moses, as noted above, the procedure of using trumpets as signals for the nation was an eternal decree. That's about as far as they go with that.
And then any other trumpet stuff?
Torah commands that the trumpets be sounded to arouse the congregation whenever the land is struck by distress, whether it is war, epidemic, or a drought. These blasts are a call to the repentance and a reminder that distress is a product of sin. For people to interpret such problems as merely coincidental is cruel, because this will prevent the nation from changing its ways and cause them to continue the corrupt practices that caused the misfortune to befall in the first place.
And who does it say that in the name of?
That one is Rambam.
Maimonides, Rambam. Okay,
Yes.
and then anything else?
Then it goes on for a day, on the day of your gladness, the trumpets were sounded by the Kohanim in conjunction with the communal elevation and peace offerings of the Sabbath and festive days. This was in addition to the musical accompaniment of the Levites at the appropriate parts of the sacrificial service. Then they go on to the order of breaking camp.
Okay, but so that means that the understanding is that the trumpet blowing related to the holidays is specifically with the offerings.
Yeah.
And that would be why we're not blowing it nowadays, because that's how they understood it.
Right.
Okay. All right. So was there anything in there that was a surprise that we saw? Yes. They added that information that there in fact are two gatherings.
Yeah.
There's a gathering of the leaders
And a gathering of the
and
entire-
gather of the entire people.
Right.
Now, did you say there was a different opinion about that, or is that the only opinion?
No, this all seems to be one opinion.
And did they say who the source of that is?
That was for lines 3 to 7. And
Right.
there's no
Source given.
source for line 8
Okay.
either.
All right.
It was just that one for 9.
All right. Does anybody else have
More comments.
more comments? I'm gonna just look in the Arya Kaplan.
Which we now know where it is.
It allowed itself to
It
be
returned.
found, so it hides again. So he just adds, I'm just going to read some of his things. In his notes, he says, in the Talmud, there is a dispute as to whether the trua mentioned here was a staccato note or a series of 3 short notes. That's the same question that causes us to have what we call shvarim trua. The tekiah, it's agreed upon, the one blast, but then there's supposed to be a broken blast, the trua. And the question is it 3 or is it a series of, longer series of staccato notes? So, so we do both. It is also noted that a series of short notes was preceded and followed by a single note. That's what the Rambam had mentioned, or so whoever had mentioned that. So apparently, and then whether or not there is a third and fourth sounding for the west and the north camps. So you read there that there is a third and fourth sounding. Apparently, he shows that there is in the midrashic, the halachic midrash with the Sifri, on this, that there is a difference of opinion. Some say they did blow a third and fourth, and some say they didn't, and you can see
this
all
one
why.
just says it's assumed.
Right. And that's it, though. He doesn't add much more. All right, so this
Rabbi,
is yeah. Go.
the only other comment I have is between what they say about going to war and then on the festivals is one, it seems that it's calling God to remember us. The other, we're blowing for us to remember that God, from the way it's phrased. It seems like that.
Okay, let's look at it again. So in 9, it says, and you will be v'nizkartem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem, and you will be remembered before the Lord your God. And then it says, it will be for you a zikaron before God.
Right.
So you're saying that the one on the holidays sounds like it's
announcing to God that we're remembering the holidays. And the other one is, hey, God, come save us. I don't know.
Right. Now, interestingly, the art scroll over there that Liz read made it sound like that was the remembering was for the people, even in verse 9. Could you read that again in verse 9? And who is the source of that?
That's the one that's on Bob.
Maimonides?
Yeah.
Okay, so
when you go to wage war in your land, the Torah commands that the trumpets be sounded to arouse the congregation whenever the land is struck by distress, whether it is war, epidemic, or drought. These blasts are a call to repentance and a reminder that distress is a product of sin. For people to interpret such problems as merely coincidental is cruel, because this will prevent the nation from changing its ways and cause them to continue the corrupt practices that caused misfortune to befall them in the first place. Well, this is Rambam. There's a whole bunch of people on that one.
right, I saw does it. There's several others. So again, the theological problem is what does it mean?
This goes back to what you were saying the other day.
Which is
the remembrance and to bring out the goodness, to not feel for people to interpret such problems as coincidental is cruel. And we went on Tuesday about not the cruelty part, but the love part.
Right.
Of taking care of each other.
Right. So the question, the way the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra are portraying this, it's a 2-step process. This is how what the Ibn Ezra, especially the Ibn Ezra's language, you will, in other words, when we are acting properly, then that causes a certain behavior from God. When we're not acting properly, it causes a different behavior from God. So let's say you're in transition. So let's say we haven't been behaving properly. And now we are behaving properly. So if you think of it in a kind of mechanical way, the way justice is understood to work is when you're behaving a particular way, justice responds this way. If you're behaving another way, justice responds that way. So if we're thinking of God, let's say as a source of justice, God's reactive. This is, you always get cautioned when you talk about the nature of God. The caution when we talk about the nature of God is we don't know how God works internally. We don't know how God works internally. The best we can do is describe God externally. In other words, we refer to God in different modes because that's how it feels. In other words, if you're in our interaction with God, it feels like we're getting one reaction when we do this and a different reaction when we do that. So it seems like God's responding to our behavior. That means God is reactive. Ultimately, when you read the Rambam's, the beginning of the Guide for the Perplexed, you just have to keep on remembering. We don't know what's going on inside of God. We don't know. We are just characterizing it as best we can as human beings who are looking at it from the outside. And even the Torah, when the Torah is talking about God, only talks about him in that way. The Torah does not share with us God's internal life. Rabbi Foreman suggests there is one exception to this, and that is the characterization of the first Shabbos. He suggests when it talks about God resting on that day and blessing the Shabbos, we are getting a view of God's internal life, as it were, briefly for a moment. But the Torah is not going to do that anymore after that. So when we talk about God, it's always with that caveat. So but let's say, so now when you think of justice, you think that it's God's responsive, God's reactive. He's not acting, he's reacting. If we behave in a certain way, then something happens. If we behave in a different way, then something happens. So we already recognize that we don't even really know how that works. Okay, we talk about it, but we don't even know. And there's so many times when we look at situations where they look completely backwards and they go upside down. So there's even a limit to how well we even understand that. But let's say that's the mechanism, that there's some kind of principle which many call the God's attribute of justice. So at work. And it might be similar to what we in Western culture, when we use the word karma. When Indian people use karma, they have very specific thing in mind. But when Western people use karma, we tend to just mean that if you behave in a certain way, it has a certain effect. And that, in other words, if you behave poorly, poor stuff's going to happen. If you behave well, good stuff's going to happen. This is very, very close to how you see God's attribute of justice. With God's attribute of justice, that's how it's often understood. Mida keneged mida, measure for measure. God responds measure for measure. Again, there's a million times we see it, we don't understand it, but that's what we say. That's what we say. So, but what would that mean? If you saw that play out in our lives, what it would mean is if we're behaving poorly, then there's going to be a poor result. It's going to come back on us and it's going to be poor. If we're behaving well, then there's going to be a good result. So that would mean, let's say I was behaving poorly up till a certain point, and then I changed my ways, and now I'm behaving well. So it would appear like our relationship with God has changed. In other words, because the judgment was coming harsh against us. Now the judgment is good against us. So it can look like when the harsh stuff is happening, it feels like God is distant.
It's like he's mad.
Right, but when we think of mad, or we think of or angry, we tend to feel distant from a person who's mad or angry at us. We tend to feel close to a person who's doing good to us. So it could feel like, in other words, you could characterize it in a certain way, like he's remembered us. In other words, that because it feels like he's distanced when the bad stuff's happening, and it feels close when the good stuff's happening. So when do we feel close to God, or when do we feel that he's close to us? When he's happy with us. When do we feel far from God? When he's not happy with us. Again, you could make this a very mechanical conversation. You do good, bad happens. You do good happens. It could be very mechanical, but in our relationship with God, we would be characterizing what is very mechanical in these terms, because that's how you would feel it. Even let's say I have a poor performance on my job. So I guess there could be poor performance on my job could call the attention of people who are regularly leaving me alone, trying to figure out why I'm doing poorly. And now I have a lot of their attention. I could feel that way, but I'm not feeling close to them. The ones who are judging me and looking over what it is. Let's say I've been in banks when they're doing an audit. I used to, for many years, I gave a class in a bank. And this, if you're a bank, you're regularly being audited.
Of course.
Those guys who come in to audit you, they're not your friend.
No.
Like you offer them coffee, you offer them other things, but they're not your friend.
No.
They're not supposed to. Yeah. So, and you're ultimately not feeling close to these people. And you hear that kind of talk within the bank, like one of these guys going and they have this thing. You could see they don't feel that
warm and fuzzy. No warmth and fuzzy.
No. Let's say the MacArthur Foundation is coming to look at something you're doing because they might want to grant you an award.
Totally different attitude.
Completely different attitude of those people that are coming in. So again, it could be there are those who would explain it very mechanically. Do good happens. Do bad happens. They could explain it mechanically. But you could say, especially because we try to use these things in our connection to God, that when bad happens, God feels distance. When good happens, he feels close. So this usage of the word to remember, he remembers us. He's remembering us, could be characterizing that change. But where did the change originate? The change originates in our change of behavior. It could be that's why Ibn Ezra and the Rambam are emphasizing that this shift, why are they saying this? Because the shift that's happening is really because of a change of behavior. But it's triggering what feels like a change in our relationship with God. That God is now paying attention is what we feel because goodness is starting to happen. The truth is, when the boss or the auditors are coming, they in truth, they may be more important to me, and they may be actually more beneficial to me when they're criticizing me or judging me than than when they're rewarding me.
Yeah, because then you know how to improve.
Right. And they may be actually much closer to me, but I don't feel that.
Right.
They may actually care more about me. It's possible that somebody who's looking carefully into what I'm doing cares more about me. And this is like with children, it's not always understood, but sometimes parents or teachers or mentors will say to a teenager, let's say, it's only because I care about you that I'm criticizing you. It's only because I care about you that I'm punishing you. It's the ultimate indication of my concern for you is that I care what you do. If I didn't care what you do, I wouldn't be paying attention to this right now. And that you're going to thank me later on, for this kind of thing.
Just wait till you have kids.
No, but they'll say things like, you're going to thank me later on. But so in a certain way, you could get to a deeper level, and you could say that when he's judging us, somebody could argue that's a closer relationship than when he's rewarding us, but it's not how it feels. It's not how it feels. So it could be that's where because it's theologically, every time this word comes up, I'm looking for there are a few times in the biblical text where something like this comes up. And one is in the book of Shmos. It comes up at the burning bush, but I wanted to see if it came up before then. I feel like it did. Oh yeah. So it doesn't use the word remember, but it uses, this is in chapter 2 of Shemot, verse 23. So it's Vayehi Bayamima Harabim Haim, and it was during the many days, these many days, in other words, long time. Vayamas Melch Mitzrayim, and the king of Egypt died. V'yonchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda, and the people of Israel groaned because of the work, and they cried out, V'ta'al shalvosam el Elokim min avoda, and their pleas or their cries went up to Elokim, which we often associate again with this, what we call attribute of justice from the work. Vayishma Elokim et nakatam, and God heard their cries. Vayizkar Elokim et brito, and God remembered his covenant et Avram v'et Yitzchak v'et Yaakov, and as the covenant with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Vayar Elokim et bnei Yisrael, and God saw the people of Israel. Vayeda Elokim, and God knew. So these are, again, theologically, this is just a lot of data, and this, mystics spend lots of time on this as theologians trying to figure out what this whole mix is. But again, you'll see that they use this kind of as you get into the deeper conversation about this moment, similar kind of talk. In other words, that there is a shift in the behavior. The people have, because of what's been going on, there's just been a shift. This again, we're talking about the nation as if it's a person. At this stage, you're talking about the nation as if it's a person, the whole nations. You're not talking about the individual stories of people that were living at that time. You're talking about the whole nation as if it's a person. So the nation itself is going through, you might say, a kind of humbling. This is how some people characterize it theologically, that as a people, we needed a certain humbling. It was already the stuff between Yosef and his brothers, which are going to be the basic DNA of the larger, early, or let's say an early embryo of what is going to be later on the Jewish people. There's hubris there. There's narcissism there. There's just there's all sorts of stuff that needs to be dealt with. So the slavery, part of the purpose of the slavery is to humble that core, to humble that core. So so you're sort of waiting to see when that core gets humbled. And then once you see that it happened, there's a kind of shift. I've never been in basic training, but I've read about it. And there's all sorts of harsh things that go on during the basic training. But one of the stated purposes of basic training is to change a group of individuals into a cohesive unit. And there's certain aspects of individualism and individual thinking that have to be changed or transformed. So there's all sorts of exercises, and the attitude of the sergeants to the soldiers, which is harsh. But the purpose of it, the goal of it, is to get to a shift, and so that there can be some kind of cohesive unit that, at its core, looks to each other and cares about each other, but is also capable of exercising whatever mission is going to come forward. So that's a kind of model that some people use for this. But so you could say that this is sort of what was being waited for, that this cry to God at some point is indicative that whatever the goal was has been reached. And so now there's a shift. The guy who was your sergeant, after basic training, might take you out for a beer and become your best friend, but not during basic training. So there's a kind of shift that is happening because whatever was supposed to happen at the core has shifted. Right. So you'll see this almost continuously, reliably, that whenever you get this kind of talk and God remembered or God knew or things, it's signaling now what we're going to feel as a different relationship with God. He's now the Savior. He's now the Savior. He's going to do salvation, miraculous salvation. But there was a waiting for a certain shift to happen, and then the change is a kind of reaction. It's not it feels like a reaction. The change is a reaction. How we behave is causing the change. But it's going to feel like he now remembers. He's now here. He's now, etc. And he wasn't here. Right. That kind of thing. Even saying reactive is a problem with the definition of God. Okay. I say we do this again. I'm suggesting we do this again next week.
That works.
And also, I'd just like to say that I was thinking this and I didn't say it out loud, but our learning is in the merit of the speedy and safe return and healthy return of all the hostages, for the healing of everyone who is wounded, for the comfort of everyone who is bereaved, for the protection of our soldiers, for the protection of our brothers, sisters, children, grandchildren, uncles and aunts, parents and grandparents that are in Israel and all around the world.